Hello and welcome. For those of you joining later, today's virtual program is called Applying Porter's Five Forces to Assess an Industry's Competitiveness. My name is Hadiza. I am the Small Business and Nonprofit Specialist with the Kansas City Public Library. And to kind of jump into things, I'm going to go ahead and read this quote here at the top by Porter himself. He was a Harvard business professor. The essence of strategy formulation is coping with competition. All right, let's get into it. As far as just a roadmap of our time today, let's talk about some of the learning objectives identified through this program. The first learning objective that we're going to cover here is to contextualize the origins and the use of Porter's five forces as a framework in order to develop a strategy. The next learning objective is to identify the steps anyone can take to set up for a good analysis of the five forces. Third, we're going to familiarize ourselves with each of the five forces that are used in the framework. And after we do that, we're going to consider some common critiques. Any framework has its pros and its drawbacks. So it's good to always consider critiques before diving in to the usage of any framework, including Porter's five forces. And then we're going to spend more time learning from an example. Um, and that example is going to cover major players in the LLM market or language learning model market using an analysis from researcher and academic Raymond Uzwishin, who is a PhD. Okay, so a little bit of background so that we can situate ourselves into some context. We're not going to get into the history of the development of Porter's five forces, but I do think that it is important to have a little bit of understanding as to why the model was developed. And what kinds of academic principles the model is based in. Okay, so um, Porter's Five Forces actually came about in 1979. Previous models like the SWOT analysis, which is very commonly used and still used, by a lot of people today. A lot of people know what a SWOT analysis is. Um, Models like that, the SWOT analysis, relied on more static key assumptions. And one of these assumptions is called perfect information symmetry. So if you've ever heard of that term, information symmetry or information asymmetry, it really just refers to when we're talking about the flow of information, whether it's from a source to a recipient. It's basically talking about who has access to more information, or are all of the players accessing the same amount of information? Basically, what Porter's Five Forces does, it allows for the basically the injection of more complexity to be able to assess more dynamic markets. So Porter's Five Forces is also based in the economics of industrial organization. So this is actually a field within the broader academic course, or I don't know, line of economics, where, industrial organization is the study of the relationship between firms or corporations and markets. So just, you can be rest assured if you do use this model and you haven't used it before, that it is absolutely born from academia and comes from a lot of rigorous study. So ultimately, all in all, what Porter's Five Forces can do is help any enterprise, any business determine the intensity of competition within an industry. And so one such way of determining the competitive intensity is to be able to identify both industries that are unattractive based off of the level of competition, and also different sectors or segments of an industry in which competition is a lot higher than other portions of an industry. So really what it does is it allows people to identify uh, when and where competition intensity is at or near pure or perfect competition. And I apologize, there's a typo right there. Forgot to include the N. All right, let's move on. So there's a few steps to take before diving into the framework itself. That again, back to previous slide, these steps allow for any firm to be able to set themselves up for a more accurate analysis. So the first thing that anybody that's representing a firm is going to want to do is to define the industry. So whether you're an existing firm or you're somebody that is thinking about different industries to enter, the first thing that you're going to do is define the industry itself that you are looking at. And so I stress this because, we're living in a time where technology, has taken over our entire lives. I don't mean it like that. I just mean, technology is embedded within every aspect of our lives. And so technology can complicate the definition of an industry. And so you want to make sure you have a definition of an industry um, that allows you to focus your ongoing analysis. And so in order to do that, you want to be able to identify the key players. So, who are the major actors within a sector of an industry? Specifying them also helps to define that industry. Um, so, you'll specify those key players and also group them into categories based on shared criteria that identify that industry at large. So, after you've identified the key players, you're going to assess those key players' strategic strengths. So in this, what you're really doing is just evaluating each player compared to the industry at large. And as you're doing that, you're going to be determining both the best and the worst strategies that a firm could use to remain or not remain competitive. And then all in all, you're going to be spending time analyzing the industry structure as a whole. And again, tech can complicate this. So what you're going to be doing here is examining the overall structure of an industry, honing in and focusing on those factors that influence profitability. These are definitely steps to take, and also to, if you're not ready to take those steps, these are actions to really keep in mind, keep in the back of your head as you continue to gather more information. Okay. Next slide. Let's talk about the five forces themselves. And we're just going to cover these very briefly before we get into some of the drawbacks and then into an example. So the first force, and these aren't necessarily in order, but these are the five forces. The first one that you'll see on the screen at the top here is called competitive rivalry. So how intense is the rivalry between firms in any given industry? The next force is asking you to consider the bargaining power of suppliers. So those firms that supply components or service or any aspect of a firm's ability to operate, um, to what extent do those suppliers, how um, how much capability do they have to set the prices? That's a way to think about power in the context of the five forces. Then we get into bargaining power of buyers. So those are the people that are, basically driving revenue in the firms that are playing within the industry. So you can just break this down into either B2B or business to business buyers or B2C, business to consumer buyers. Fourth force that we see here on the screen is called the threat of substitution, which really is just asking the question, how easily can the good or service in question that is central to the industry, how easily can that good or service be replaced with something else? And last but not least, and this is something, especially within tech industries, and as we consider the existence of open source software, um, we want to be thinking about the threat of new entrants. How quickly can a new firm, no matter its size, enter the industry? And so, again, with the proliferation of tech, when we talk about the threat of new entrants, we're also talking about, in some cases, market fragmentation. So I just mentioned open source. Open source versus closed source. Open source is something where anybody, even without coding skills, can access a tool without having to pay for it. That information or that the capability of that tool is something, again, that anyone can access. And so there's not that much differentiation unless the user of that tool is able to supplement the tool in some way to make it more unique. So that just means then that those that are using open source tools within the tech industry are able, in theory, to enter the market rather quickly. But are they competitive? And are they operating within a larger industry as a whole? Or does that entry, in as far as using open source, does that entry further fragment the larger industry to create more of a difference between open source versus closed source? So I know I just kind of threw a lot at you, and if you're not familiar with open source and closed source, don't worry too much about it. It's just to kind of illustrate that, again, when we're talking about tech and we're talking about the fact that tech really is embedded in so much of our lives, and implicated within just about any industry, we do have to consider things in a more nuanced and dynamic way. And I believe that using Porter's five forces allows for that. Okay, let's get to the next slide. So I was just, kind of singing praises about Porter's five forces. Let's talk about a few critiques of the framework. So I was just talking about dynamics and nuance. Some critiques of the framework say that Porter's five forces is not easily applied to rapidly changing industries. And I think that can be true to an extent. Um, if you're using the framework in kind of a rigid sense, without necessarily taking the time up front to identify, basically to cover the steps to take um, before actually diving into the framework. Another critique of the framework is that it has a tendency to overemphasize competition, while kind of ignoring the possibilities of collaboration, which kind of also then feeds into kind of a rigid application of the framework itself. And another critique that I'm just going to name here is that the framework sometimes fails to consider the impact of globalization. And we can think of this as, when was this framework first established? That could be a reason. But again, this is often due to its application being used in a more rigid context. And so, really quick here, I'm going to back up and just kind of reiterate the steps to take before analyzing the forces. And again, so we're talking first about defining the industry, identifying the key players, assessing the strategic strengths. And so it's really at the step of assessing the strategic strengths of each key player and then also analyzing the industry structure as a whole, in which you can start to really capture the dynamics of a rapidly changing industry before you start to actually apply the forces themselves. And this is a way to make the application of the framework a lot less rigid to avoid some of the drawbacks that we just covered in the common critiques of Porter's five forces slide. Okay, so hopefully that is making sense as far as how to use this in a more nuanced way so that it is relevant for our times. We are going to cover now an example. And so this is, rehashing what I introduced earlier as far as covering a dynamic industry. We're talking here about the large language model market. And so if you've never heard of that, it's abbreviated as an LLM, and you can think of this as basically AI. So LLMs, let's just kind of define what an LLM is. Sorry, I sometimes speak a little faster than I can think. So LLMs are computational models whose aim is to achieve language generation. So you want to think of things like ChatGPT and OpenAI that people use to generate text and to also complete different tasks. Excuse me. So sophisticated software programs then are capable of classifying and using language without direct commands of a human operator. The most popular of these large language models as of 2024 are in the form of generative AI. And it's been generative AI that has been the product driving most of the industrial growth. And they do this, generative AI has been doing this by drawing in both large tech giants as well as the most advanced of the AI startups. So this information is coming from a resource called Statista, which you can access in the digital catalog. It is linked below. You can find it under the S category within the A to Z list of our digital resources. All right, next slide. So continuing to kind of just get more into the weeds of what the large language model product entails and the industry at large. So large language models are primarily divided into open source and closed source. And so I started talking about this earlier. This is definitely something very important to keep in mind if you are, wanting to do an analysis of the LLM industry yourself, or just to understand AI and what are the forces that are driving competition amongst the large players in AI that, surrounds our lives. So what this really means as far as the difference between open source and closed source in the context of the large language model market is really just meaning that the open source large language models um, have code, have underlying code that is freely available to the public, whereas the closed source large language models do not have code that is available to the public, which means that the code that they have, the closed source code, tends to be more proprietary. So the largest players in this market are ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, Llama, and Mistral. Those are the names of the LLMs. So these players are supported by the largest and wealthiest tech companies globally. So these listed players, they are the main players because they consistently outrank other players in the market in terms of common, basically AI metrics. So ultimately, what this just means is that these are the players that are able to solve a wide variety of tasks more quickly and more accurately than other players. So these are the shining models. These are the players that everybody wants to be like. So as far as those large and wealthy tech companies that the large players are supported by, let's go ahead and name them. So Google, Microsoft, Meta, Amazon, Apple, and Nvidia. These are the large corporations, the large global multinational corporations that have ownership or long-standing cooperation agreements in within the LLM market. Again, this information is taken from Statista. All right, so ultimately, we know, and we can probably just know this based off of like any time we want to do a basic search using Google, uh, we can see that LLMs are growing. So as the use of AI continues to expand, continues to grow, its capabilities are also growing. So you can do more and more with AI. AI has become more and more accurate over time. So that also means that the large language models themselves also continue to grow. So how do they grow? If you know anything about machine learning, then you know that large language models um, are, they have to use something called training data in order to expand their capabilities. So using this data is what is going to drive the growth of LLMs. LLMs are going to train on more and more data, and data requires storage. Storage requires the use of energy, water, and specialized labor for development, which all require monetary investment. So as natural resources are used more and more, and as more and more labor is required, again, more investment is going to be required to produce models that become more and more precise over time. These models will also, and especially in the case of China, we're not going to really get into that right now. But as these models develop and get more precise and use more and more data, they're also going to be creating solutions for decreased usage of resources so that they can run. So they're becoming more and more efficient over time, which is going to continue to drive that growth. So all in all, it really just means that competitive players are going to be the ones that develop more efficiently than other players, meaning they're going to be using resources a lot more wisely, with less waste. So that just means, again, developmental efficiency will become more and more of an edge that firms strive to achieve. So that is going to be, I don't know what phrase to use or what idiom to use, but it's kind of, oh, the North Star. That's essentially the North Star that any of these competitive firms are going to be looking at. And it only makes sense because we only have one Earth. You can't continuously use resources at the same rate and expect those resources to just replenish themselves. So to be able to address the problem of energy usage as efficiently as possible over time is really going to be the driving edge of any firm. And so you might, take some time to look up different examples of that. I don't know whether they're using Porter's five forces or it's just kind of a summary of the industry at large. You might find information about LLMs that don't necessarily talk about data storage. And that you might, you know, take that however you will, but in my personal opinion, when reading about the growth of LLMs, if you're not finding information that talks about energy storage or energy usage and data storage, there might be a reason for that. And I'll just leave it at that. Okay, let's get into Porter's five forces applied to the LLM market. And again, I didn't make this. Um, there's a link that will be included with this presentation to the source. So let's get into it. The threat of new entrants. So listed here are four different facts, basically, about the large language model market that really have serious implications for the ability of a new firm to enter the market. So I'll just list them. We've got high capital requirements. We've got the need for data acquisition and curation. We've got the existence of scarcity and specialized talent. And then we've got the the need basically to develop economies of scale and to basically work through learning curves over time. So just kind of diving into this, high capital requirements, when we're talking about the in the context of large language model markets, to train these large language models, excuse me, not large language markets. When it comes to training large language models, they require massive computational resources, as I've just mentioned. So the cost of conducting these computational methods uh, is high, and it can range from the tens and hundreds of thousands to the millions of dollars. So that requires high capital investment. If you don't have that capital, you can't really consider yourself a potential new entrant. Um, Data acquisition and curation. So that open source data, anyone can access it. It doesn't necessarily on its own lead to differentiation. That differentiation, if you're using open source, is going to come from how that data is presented, how the access to that data is optimized, not the data itself. Then we've got the closed source data sets. These are proprietary data sets that offer an edge, but those require upfront investment. So here we're seeing a potential way to develop an edge after already having high capital investment. Then we get into specialized talent scarcity. So the reality is there's just not enough people with the specialized skill to be able to keep that price of labor lower. So you're gonna have to, open up the pocketbooks and invest in that talent if you want that talent to help drive your business, which you should. So that labor is needed in AI research, in deep learning, and in large scales engineering. So if you've got the means to be able to find that talent, that's going to give you an edge. Then we've got, repeating again, economies of scale and learning curves. So veteran players, the ones that have been existing in the space, they benefit and have an inherent baked-in advantage versus new entrants because they've got compounded experience that has turned into expertise over time. This is not something that can be replicated except by can't replicate it. It's just something that comes with time. Um, so if you're a new entrant, you are competing against established compounded experience that is applied into new contexts. And you're also competing against veteran players that have established distribution channels and optimized infrastructure. So that's Porter's force of the threat of the new entrants applied to the large language model market. Okay, now we're getting into the bargaining power of suppliers. So when we're talking about the large language model market, we have to understand that the supplier power is highly concentrated to specific components that every LLM needs to operate. So we've got something called semiconductor manufacturers. Every LLM needs one. NVIDIA. So the other way you can talk about semiconductors is to just call them GPUs. Um, NVIDIA operates as a near monopoly within the LLM market, which means that they have the ability to set the price a lot, much more than any other player. So take that how you will, understand what a monopoly is, and understand how monopolies can dominate an industry. Then we have cloud infrastructure providers. These providers have a strategic interest in fostering a diverse AI ecosystem. So if they didn't have that, they wouldn't be as collaborative. Um, so that strategic interest mitigates the power of their substantial capital investment in the building and maintaining of global data centers. So something very important to consider as far as the bargaining power of suppliers goes. Basically, the cloud infrastructure providers are able to do more collective bargaining because of their shared strategic interest. Um, then we've got specialist AI talent. So this is going back to talking about the threat of new entrants, how those firms that are able to invest in AI talent are going to have an edge. So this is just kind of making it more clear that the scarcity in this talent allows for those labor providers to set a higher price for their labor, because there's a lot of demand for their expertise and their abilities. Then we've got data providers. So, as far as the bargaining power goes as a supplier, they're relatively low as far as the way that they can kind of wield their power. And this is because of fragmented sources. Again, the difference between open source and closed source. So the ones that are providing closed source data or proprietary data are going to have more power than open source data providers. So when we're talking about the bargaining power of suppliers, and we're talking specifically about data providers within this industry, this is where we start to talk. This is where we start to have to seriously consider the impact of fragmentation and how, um, as time moves forward, there's going to be more and more of a difference between open source and closed source. All right. Now we're talking about bargaining power of buyers. And when we're talking about LLMs, we're really talking about mostly B2B or business to business buyers, because those are the ones that are going to have the most power. Um, so this is the power that's growing, particularly amongst firms. So let's start with the large enterprises. So these are the enterprises that have that compounded experience, who have developed kind of economies of scale and have gone past the point of inflection in the learning curve. So these are now teachers within the industry. They are able to apply their expertise accumulated over time to make better decisions for themselves and spend less time experimenting and more time developing scaled and targeted solutions for their own operations. Um, so again, yes, they're using experience accumulated over time and they're using previous investment over time. And so, yeah, these are going to be the enterprises that have the most power amongst the LLMs, as far as being able to negotiate for what's best for them. Then we've got developers and startups. So these are going to be players that have relatively less power compared to large enterprises, and they're going to have a lot more price sensitivity. So this is a group that can find a little bit of an edge from the natural proliferation of the models themselves, particularly in the open source segment. So these are going to be players that if they consider this, they're going to potentially draw up an edge by finding ways to innovate from open source data, from using large language models over open source data to innovate. And that's going to be a different type of innovation than using LLMs over closed source training data. Then, last but not least, is the bargaining power of individual end users. So one sole individual is not going to have that much power unless there are other factors involved, like, say, an individual user somehow becomes noteworthy by publicizing some weird thing that happens when they use AI. This is just me riffing off the top of my head because I'm thinking about things in the context of social media as well. So you never know how far one individual could go, and I'm just naming that because that's something to consider as time moves forward. So there's minimal individual bargaining power, but that power can absolutely become uh built in a collective sense. And this is primarily through the means of providing feedback. So if a firm values feedback from the end user, that power is going to be a lot higher. If a firm doesn't value that, that power isn't going to be super valuable unless that feedback is something that implicates other individual end users. So, a lot of people talk about the drawbacks of AI. There's studies that come out, have been coming out about the use of AI and how it's, causing issues. I'm not about to cite anything right now, but that is becoming more and more of a topic, not just what are the benefits of AI, but how is it impacting people on an individual basis? How is it impacting people's ability to relate to each other? How is it impacting memory, uh, new information retention, the ability to do things that we normally do? These are things that are all coming out in the public domain. So as this information continues to come out and as individuals start to recognize some of the drawbacks themselves, if they don't have controls in place to use AI, um, the power of an individual end user could grow. And I want to just frame things that way because I don't think you're going to find too much of that information when we're talking about analyzing the industry itself from kind of like more of an insider perspective. Okay, so now we've got the threat of substitution. So what does this mean? This again just means how easily can the use of an LLM be replaced? How can I use something else to create the same results? So there are alternative AI and machine learning approaches. Um, so there are other things that use machine learning in addition to large language models. So these other solutions could produce more efficient, easier to interpret, or more cost-effective results than what we are referring to as general purpose large language models. Um, Traditional software and automation, a lot of this technology can do the same things that LLMs can do. So existing solutions that don't use AI can oftentimes fulfill certain tasks without the need to use LLMs. And some people are opting for that. Some firms, some people. Human labor. So especially when we're talking about the art context, this has been a common critique of AI images, right? Why would we put in a prompt to create an image that we can tell is artificial versus just hiring an artist to make something more original and has the human touch. So when we're talking about creative and complex reasoning, by and large, human labor remains the primary solution. There's a lot of reasons for that. So last but not least, one substitute is kind of like maybe we could call this a little bit cannibalistic, but other types of LLMs can replace existing LLMs. So more and more, one type of LLM can work as a substitute for another. I won't get too deep into that because that gets a little bit mind-boggly. Okay, so now let's talk about the intensity of the rivalry among existing competitors. So again, identifying the key players, we've got OpenAI, which is backed by Microsoft. Then we've got Gemini, backed by Google. We've got Llama, backed by Meta. And then we've got Mistral, which is open source and backed by Microsoft. If we're going to situate this in a global context, each of these key players are competing against players within the Chinese market who, if you know anything about China's developments with AI and LLMs, you know that China is way ahead of everybody else as far as data storage goes. So that is the key thing that players in the US and the rest of the world compared to China are going to be competing and continuing to compete against China for the ability uh, to be more efficient. So another key component of this high rivalry is we've got high stakes and investment. So within this industry, innovation is everything. So that just means investment in R&D is high. If you don't have a high investment in research and development, you can you can, expect not to get very far, even in just ideation. So they're competing to innovate. So therefore, the investment in R&D is high. And that investment in R&D also means there's a high investment in marketing to ensure that the solutions are being recognized by the market at large. Then we've got open source disruption. So, whereas closed source requires more upfront investment, open source does not. So players are identifying ways to disrupt open source as a way to lower the stakes of competition, but then inject an innovation that can then go back and raise those stakes. So the strategy of open sourcing large language models, again, like Llama and Mistral, challenges the closed source models like OpenAI. So this just allows open source to kind of become more on the same playing field within the larger market as closed source. So this is just intensifying competition by increasing access and then also commoditizing the core capabilities of large language models. So let's go through a summary. So we've got a dynamic market with geopolitical fault lines, i.e., the US and European firms versus China's market. Then we've got high rivalry that's fueled by strategic imperatives that require high investment in research and development. Basically, key players are working very hard to out-innovate each other wherever they can. As far as foundational models go, remains high barriers for those. This is slightly mitigated by access to open source innovation, which means firms are trying more and more to innovate over open source data to make that innovation more downstream. And really, when we're talking about downstream innovation, what we're really talking about is continuous improvement of common shared tasks of LLMs. So, which firm, which solution, which LLM is going to um, do a better job of the same tasks with open source data? So then we've got the existence of supplier power. That power is concentrated in components, which are chips and cloud infrastructure. Then we've got buyer power, which is most potent, coming from well-established and experienced enterprises. And then last but not least, we've got the threat of substitutes that is increasing, particularly in alternative AI and software, as well as different types of language learning models. So that just means there is more and more substitution of specific large language models for more general large language models. All right, last but not least here, I want to point out where you can find a template for Porter's Five Forces in the Kansas City Public Library digital catalog. What we're looking at here is a screenshot of a tool called Gale Business Plan Builder, and we've got a link here. So with this tool, you'll find it under G in the A to Z list. You will create an account with your email address, and you'll set a password so that you can log in and save your work over time. And when you do log in, I want to point out you will have access to a dashboard here on the left-hand side. And to access Porter's Five Forces, you will go under the second module that you see here called Business Ideation. You'll click on the drop down and you'll then click on Other Business Ideation, where you'll see the Canvas, the SWOT, PEST, and then highlighted here in yellow, Porter's Five Forces. All right, so that concludes our time for today. Hopefully you've taken something useful from our time to help embark on the very exciting process of learning more about the competitive nature of any industry that you are looking at. We took a look at a very dynamic industry, that of the large language model market, and we talked about forces that affect each of the key players that are absolutely changing in real time. So I hope the information was good, and I hope that you enjoyed your time. Thank you very much.